Chapter 33 – My Vision of the Spheres. How can I tell of the many friends who came to visit me in this bright home, of the cities I saw in that fair land, the lovely scenes I visited? I cannot. It would take volumes, and already my narrative has reached its limits. I shall only tell of one more vision that I had, because in it I was shown a new path wherein I was to labor. One in which I could apply to the aid of others the lessons I had learned in my wanderings. I was lying on the couch in my room and had awakened from a long slumber. I was watching, as I often did, those two most beautiful figures of my guardian angels, and seeing fresh beauties, fresh meanings in their faces and their attitudes every time I looked at them. When I became conscious that my Eastern guide, Franchezzo, in his far-off sphere was seeking to communicate with me, I therefore allowed myself to become perfectly passive, and soon felt a great cloud of light of a dazzling white misty substance surrounding me. It seemed to shut out the walls of my room and everything from me. Then my soul seemed to arise from my spirit body and float away, leaving my spirit envelope lying upon the couch. I appeared to pass upwards and still upwards, as though the will of my powerful guide was summoning me to him. And I floated on and on with a sense of lightness, which even as a spirit I had never felt before. At last I alighted upon the summit of a high mountain, from which I could behold the earth and its lower and higher spheres revolving below me. I also saw that sphere which was my home, but it appeared to lie far below the height upon which I stood. Beside me was Franchezzo, and as in a dream I heard his voice speaking to me and saying, "Behold, son of my adoption, the new path in which I would have you labor. Behold earth and her attendant spheres, and see how important to her welfare is this work in which I would have you to take part. See now the value of the power you have gained in your journey to the kingdoms of hell, since it will enable you to become one of the great army who daily and hourly protect mortal men from the assaults of hell's inhabitants. Behold this panorama of the spheres, and learn how you can assist in a work as mighty as the spheres themselves." I looked to where he pointed, and I beheld the circling belt of the great earth plane. Its magnetic currents like the ebb and flow of an ocean tide, bearing on their waves countless millions upon millions of spirits. I saw all those strange elemental astral forms, some grotesque, some hideous, some beautiful. I saw also the earth-bound spirits of men and women still tied by their gross pleasures or their sinful lives, many of them using the organisms of mortals to gratify their degraded cravings. I beheld these and kindred mysteries of the earth plane, and I likewise beheld sweeping up from the dark spheres below waves of dark and awful beings, 10 times more deadly unto man and their influence over him than those dark spirits of the earth plane. I saw these darker beings crowd around man and cluster thickly near him, and where they gathered they shut out the brightness of the spiritual sun, whose rays shine down upon the earth continually. They shut out this light, with the dark mass of their own cruel evil thoughts, and where this cloud rested there came murder and robbery, and cruelty and lust, and every kind of oppression were in their train, and death and sorrow followed them. Wherever man had cast aside from him the restraints of his conscience, and had given way to greed and selfishness, and pride and ambition, there did these dark beings gather, shutting out the light of truth with their dark bodies. And again I saw many mortals who mourned for the dear ones they had loved and lost, weeping most bitter tears, because they could see them no more. And all the time I saw those for whom they mourned standing beside them, seeking with all their power to show that they still lived, still hovered near, and that death had not robbed of one loving thought, one tender wish, those whom death had left behind to mourn. All in vain seemed their efforts. The living could not see or hear them, and the poor sorrowing spirits could not go away to their bright spheres, because while those they had left so mourned for them they were tied to the earth plane by the chains of their love, and the light of their spirit lamps grew dim and faded as they thus hung about the atmosphere of earth in helpless sorrow. And Franchezzo said to me, "Is there no need here for the means of communication between these two, the living and the so-called dead, that the sorrowful ones on both sides may be comforted? And, again, is there no need for communication that those other sinful selfish men may be told of the dark beings hovering around them who seek to drag their souls to hell?" Then I beheld a glorious dazzling light as of a sun in splendor, shining as no mortal eye ever saw the sunshine on earth. and its rays dispelled the clouds of darkness and sorrow, and I heard a glorious strain of music from the celestial spheres. And I thought, surely now man will hear this music, and see this light and be comforted. But they could not. Their ears were closed by the false ideas they had gathered. And the dust and dross of earth clogged their spirits, and made their eyes blind to the glorious light which shone for them in vain. Then I beheld other mortals, whose spiritual sight was partly unveiled, and whose ears were not quite deaf, and they spoke of the spirit world and its wondrous beauties. They felt great thoughts and put them into the language of earth. They heard the wondrous music, and tried to give it expression. They saw lovely visions and tried to paint them, as like to those of the spirit as the limits of their earthly environments would allow. And these mortals were termed geniuses, and their words and their music and their pictures all helped to raise men's souls nearer to the God who gave that soul, for all that is highest and purest and best comes from the inspiration of the spirit world. Yet with all this beauty of art and music and literature, with all these aspirations, with all the fervor of religious feeling, there was still no way open by which men on earth could hold communion with the loved ones who had gone before them into the land which dwellers upon earth have called the land of shades, and from whose bourne, they thought, no traveler could return, a land that was all vague and empty to their thought. And there was likewise no means by which those spirit ones who sought to help man to a higher, purer knowledge of truth could communicate with him directly. The ideas and the fallacies of ancient theories formulated in the days of the world's infancy continually mixed with the newer, more perfect sight which the spirit world sought to give, and clouded its clearness, and refracted its rays, so that they reached the minds of mortals broken and imperfect. Then I beheld that the walls of the material life were pierced with many doors, and at each door stood an angel to guard it. And from each door on earth even to the highest spheres I saw a great chain of spirits, each link being one stage higher than the one below it. And to mortals upon earth were given the keys of these doors that they might keep them open, and that between mortals and the spirit world there might be communication. But, alas, as time passed on I saw that many of those who held these keys were not faithful. They were allured by the joys and the gifts of earth, and turned aside and suffered their doors to close. Others again kept their doors, but partly open, and where only light and truth should have shone they suffered errors and darkness to creep in. And again the light from the spirit world was sullied and broken as it passed through these darkened doorways. Still more sad, as time passed on, the light ceased to shine at all and gave place to the thick impure rays from dark deceitful spirits from the lower sphere. And at last the angel would close that door to be opened no more on earth. Then I turned from this sad sight, and beheld many new doors opened where mortals stood, whose hearts were pure and unselfish and unsullied by the desires of earth. And through these doors poured such a flood of light upon the earth that my eyes were dazzled, and I had to turn aside. When I looked again I saw these doorways thronged by spirits, beautiful, bright spirits, and others whose raiment was dark, and their hearts sad because their lives had been sinful, but in whose souls there was a desire for good, and there were spirits who were fair and bright, but sorrowful, because they could speak no more with those whom they had left on earth. And I beheld the sorrowful and the sinful spirits alike comforted and helped by means of the communication with the earth, and in the hearts of many mortals there was joy. For death's dark curtain was drawn aside and there was news from those beyond the grave. Then I saw pass before me great armies of spirits from all the higher spheres, their raiment of purest white, and their helmets of silver and gold glittering in the glorious spiritual light. And some among them seemed to be the leaders who directed the others in their work. And I asked, who are these? Were they ever mortal men? And Orion answered me, these were not only mortal men, but they were many of them men of evil lives, who by reason thereof descended to those kingdoms of hell which you have seen. But who because of their great repentance, and the many and great works of atonement which they have done, and the perfect conquest over their own lower natures which they have gained, are now the leaders in the armies of light, the strong warriors who protect men from the evils of those lower spheres. From time to time I saw dark masses of spirits, like waves washing on a shore, and flowing over portions of the earth, drawn thither by man's own evil desires and greedy selfishness. And then I would see them driven back by the armies of light spirits, For between these two there was a constant conflict, and the prize for which they contended was man's soul. And yet these two contending forces had no weapons but their wills. They fought not save with the repelling powers of their magnetism, which was so antagonistic that neither could long remain in close contact with the other. Franchezzo pointed out to me one door at which stood a mortal woman, and said, "Behold, the chain there isn't complete. It wants still one link between her and the spirit chain. Go down and form that link, and then will your strength protect her and make her strong. Then will you guard her from those dark spirits who hover near, and help her to keep open her door. Your wanderings in those lower spheres have given you the power of repelling their inhabitants. And where stronger power is required, it will be sent to protect her, and those who seek to communicate through her will do so only when you see fit. And when you desire to rest in the spirit world, another guide will take your place. And now look again at the earth and the conflict that surrounds it." I looked as he spoke, and saw black thunder clouds hovering over the earth and gathering dark as night. And a sound as of a rushing storm swept upwards from the dark spheres of hell, and like the waves of a storm-tossed ocean, these dark clouds of spirits rolled up against the sea of bright spirits, sweeping them back and rolling over the earth, as though to blot out from it the light of truth. And they assailed each door of light and sought to overwhelm it. Then did this war in the spirit world become a war amongst men, nation fighting against nation for supremacy. It seemed as though in the great thirst for wealth and greed for conquest, all nations and all peoples must be engulfed, so universal was this war. And I looked to see were there none to aid, none who would come forth from the realms of light and wrest from the dark spirits their power over the earth. The seething mass of dark spirits were attacking those doors of light and striving to sweep away those poor faithful mortals who stood within them. That man might be driven back to the days of his ignorance again. Then it was that like a star in the east I saw a light, glittering and dazzling all by its brightness, and it came down and grew till I saw it was a vast host of radiant angels from the heavenly spheres. And with their coming those other bright spirits whom I had seen driven back by the forces of evil gathered together again and joined those glorious warriors, and this great ocean of light. This mighty host of bright spirits swept down to earth and surrounded it with a great belt of glorious light. Everywhere I saw the rays of light, like spears, darting down and rending the dark mass in 1,000 places. Like swords of fire flashed these dazzling rays, and cut through the dark wall of spirits on all sides, scattering them to the four winds of heaven. Vainly did their leaders seek to gather their forces together again, vainly seek to drive them on. A stronger power was opposed to them, and they were hurled back by the brightness of these hosts of heaven till, like a dark and evil mist, they sank down, rolling back to those dark spheres from which they had come. And who were these bright angels? I asked again, these warriors who never drew back yet never slew, who held in check these mighty forces of evil. Not with the sword of destruction, but by the force of their mighty wills, by the eternal power of good over evil? And the answer was, they are those who are also the redeemed ones of the darkest spheres, who long ages ago have washed their sin-stained garments in the pools of repentance, and have, by their own labors, risen from the ashes of their dead selves to higher things, not through a belief in the sacrifice of an innocent life for their sins, but by many years of earnest labors, many acts of atonement, by sorrow and by bitter tears, by many weary hours of striving to conquer first the evil in themselves, that they who have overcome may help others who sin to do so likewise. These are the angels of the heavenly spheres of earth, once men like themselves and able to sympathize with all the struggles of sinful men. A might host they are, ever strong to protect, powerful to save. My vision of the earth and its surroundings faded away, and in its stead I beheld one lone star shining above me with a pure silver light. And its ray fell like a thin thread of silver upon the earth, and upon the spot where my beloved dwelt. Franchezzo said to me, "Behold the star of her earthly destiny, how clear and pure it shines, and know, O beloved pupil, that for each soul born upon earth there shines in the spiritual heavens such a star, whose path is marked out when the soul is born. A path it must follow to the end, unless by an act of suicide it sever the thread of the earthly life, and by thus transgressing a law of nature plunge itself into great sorrow and suffering. Do you mean that the fate of every soul is fixed, and that we are but straws floating on the stream of our destiny? Not quite. The great events of the earth life are fixed. They will inevitably be encountered at certain periods of the earthly existence. And they are such events as those wise guardians of the angelic spheres deem to be calculated to develop and educate that soul. How these events will affect the life of each soul, whether they shall be the turning point for good or ill, for happiness or for sorrow, rests with the soul itself. And this is the prerogative of our free will, without which we would be but puppets, irresponsible for our acts, and worthy of neither reward nor punishment for them. But to return to that star, note that while the mortal follows the destined path with earnest endeavor to do right in all things, while the soul is pure and the thoughts unselfish, then does that star shine out with a clear unsullied ray, and light the pathway of the soul. The light of this star comes from the soul, and is the reflection of its purity. If, then, the soul cease to be pure, if it develops lower instead of its higher attributes, the star of that soul's destiny will grow pale and faint, the light flickering like some willow-the wisp hovering over a dark morass. No longer will it shine as a clear beacon of the soul. And at last, if the soul become very evil, the light of the star will die out and expire, to shine no more upon its earthly path. It is by watching these spiritual stars, and tracing the path marked out for them in the spiritual heavens, that spirit seers are able to foretell the fate of each soul. And from the light given by the star to say whether the life of the soul is good or evil. Adieu, and may the new field of your labors yield you the fairest fruits. He ceased speaking, and my soul seemed to sink down and down till I reached the spirit body I had left lying on my couch. And for a brief moment as I re-entered it I lost consciousness. Then I awoke to find myself in my own room, with those beautiful white angels hovering over me, symbols, as my father had said, of eternal protection.